Good morning from a chilly, rainy, windy experience down here at Mykonos in Langaban on the west coast. Lovely to be here. Let's get into our study. I want to read to you out of Daniel chapter 1. And as we've read, we know that we are now in a war zone. And we are living in the last days, also in a war zone, and that the devil has a plan. His plan is to confuse us. His plan is to brainwash us. His plan is to let us forget God. And I want to show you this. The purpose of Babylon, or the meaning of Babylon, means confused. And God asks us to come out of confusion. So let me look at it. Daniel chapter 1, we find ourselves with Jerusalem being defeated. We find ourselves in Babylon. We find ourselves in a place where everybody seems to be clever. They know what they're talking about. It seems as if the wisdom of God is stupidity. But I want to show you something today that is quite remarkable. In Daniel chapter 1, we find an interesting story playing out. Remember, I told you stories are there to help us to know how we must behave in those moments when the devil is trying to do the things to us that he did to people of old. Now, Daniel and his three friends had Hebrew names. And one of the first things that King Nebuchadnezzar instructed Ashpenaz to do was to change their Hebrew names and to give them Babylonian names. And I want to show you why this was so important and what was the objective of Nebuchadnezzar in doing this. You'll notice that the name Daniel in the Hebrew means God is my judge. Now when you read there in verse 6 of Daniel chapter 1, it says, among these were some from Judea. Remember, they were some of the descendants of Hezekiah, who were princes of his royal kingdom. They were taken as captive and made eunuchs. And these three young Hebrew boys, as well as Daniel, find themselves in Nebuchadnezzar's service. Daniel's name is mentioned there. Then we have Hananiah, and we have Mishael, and we have Azariah. The chief official, which is Ashpenaz, gave them new names. This is in verse 10. To Daniel, he gave the name, and Daniel, remember, is God is my judge. Every time his mother called him Daniel, he was reminded that God would ultimately be the judge of his life. His name was changed from Daniel to Belshazzar, but Daniel changes it to Belteshazzar, which means that he was to be the keeper of the treasures of Bel-Marduk. Now this was supposed to be an honor in Babylon. Science was the thing. Science was the God of the world. And if you look at our world today, it seems as if science has replaced the God of the Word of God. It's terrible, but Darwin, not so very long ago, brought up this theory that we are not created beings, but that we actually have grown from simple cells to these complex, beautiful pieces of creation. That everything we see around us has grown through millions of years. What a challenge to our brains. What a brainwashing effect that it has had on the world, that most of the world actually believes that we have developed from a little cell in the sea and we've grown to be where we are. God reminds us in his word. He says, remember that I am the God who created you. I made everything you see in 6 days. And I want you to remember this. Now, we find that his friend Hananiah, his name meant God is merciful, God is gracious. It's interesting that all the mercies and the good things that happen to us in our lives are actually gifts and acts of God. And yet his name was changed from Hananiah to Shadrach, which means that he was to be the servant of Aku, which was the moon god. That he no longer was God's servant, but a servant of creation. What a tragic story. We then have Mishael, which means God's gift. He was constantly reminded by his parents that he was God's gift to them. And all the beautiful things of their lives they recognized as God's gift. Yet his name was changed to Meshach, which means who is like Aku, which means Aku again, the goddess, the moon goddess, that he was actually created in her image. What a tragedy. Again, what a brainwashing effect that Babylon is trying to have on God's children. And then we have Azariah, which in the Hebrew meant God is my helper. Every time Azariah found himself in difficult circumstances where he didn't know what to do, he knew that God would be his helper. His name is changed to Abednego, which means that he was a servant of Nebu. Now Nebu was the son of Bel-Marduk, and that he was to be his servant and not God's servant. Can you see how that the objective of the devil is to brainwash you, to let you forget in whose beautiful image you were created? In Genesis chapter 1, we are told when God decided to create this world and to particularly create us, he said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. The God of this world, the God of science, is trying to get you to forget that God is your creator. I want you to do what Daniel did in Daniel chapter 1 verse 8. He says, but Daniel resolved. Daniel made a decision not to allow the things of this world to confuse him, but that he would always remember that he was Daniel, and that Daniel meant that God would be his judge. I challenge you today not to allow yourself to be caught up with the science of this world and the intelligence of this world, and to think that you are clever when you do so, but that you will humble yourself before the God of creation, that you will remember that you are his sons and daughters today. As you go about, be that light, be that example, show them that you know that you belong to God and that you were created in his beautiful image. May God bless you today.